Before we can go on to project planning, we need to discuss yarn and what is going to be an appropriate choice for your Rigid-Heddle loom as a warping material. Now, I'm overemphasizing the warping material because those are the threads that are put under the most tension. They are engaging with our heddle, and so we have more restrictions in place. When it comes to a weft material, my rule of thumb is as long as it fits within the interior of the shed and it supports the design, anything goes. Let's look at some rules of thumb that will help us determine if a thread is appropriate as a warp material. I'm going to pull over here a yarn that we use a lot here in our studio. It's called 8/4 Cotton Carpet Warp. It is a 4-ply thread made of 100% cotton, and oftentimes I will observe a new weaver taking segments of yarn to test its strength, and they will take a segment and snap it, to them indicating that this thread is not strong enough to hold up under tension on the loom. However, what I'd like to point out in this demonstration is you are putting on that yarn during that breaking process far more than ever it would experience under tension on your loom. As the threads are being supported by many other threads, you will find that it definitely holds up to the type of strength required for tension. A better way to test a thread for its strength is to pull out about 18 inches between your two thumbs and pull on it gently. As I pull on it, and the whites of my fingers are actually showing because I'm pulling so hard, this is better replicating the tension that would be experienced on the loom as it is tension from the front to back beam because it's of the same proportion. As I'm pulling on the thread, I'm observing not only its strength, but I'm also observing its elasticity. You can see I'm actually able to pluck a tune on this thread. Far more tension you would ever have on these threads. Knowing this, it gives me the green flag to say, yep, totally appropriate to put on the loom. When you're pulling out and observing other materials, here are 2 rayons that I have in my stash here in the studio. And stash busting is a really, really fun thing to do on the Rigid-Heddle because it doesn't require a lot of materials. Both of these are similar in proportion. They're both going to give me a nice, flat, and shiny appearance, support my design, and perhaps add a little extra emphasis. However, when I pull out the 18 inches of this first example, you can see just like the carpet warp, it doesn't move. This is a fabulous yarn to consider. Let's look at its brother here. This one, although made by the same company, in its proportions, you can see that as I pull on it, it moves more like a rubber band. This is one that I would avoid putting on your loom if it was going to make up a large percentage of the piece. It doesn't discount it from being used at all, but you should have other threads around it supporting it so that your whole warp does not move like a rubber band. If I were to warp my loom entirely with a yarn like this, as I tried to establish tension on my threads, it would stretch and stretch and stretch till it reached its final point. As I'm weaving, creating what I think is a balanced weave structure, once the tension is left off and it's allowed to relax, will come down in that rubber band effect, creating a much denser fabric than I was anticipating and experiencing on the loom itself during the weaving process. So again, if it's got a bunch of buddies supporting it with less elasticity, it's fine to use, but not solely by itself. In observing other yarns, you'll also want to consider things like texture. Texture can be problematic on the loom because those threads need to travel through the heddle, both in the slots and the holes. As you're looking and considering yarns of texture, think about the weaving process. As you are creating your shed and the heddle is moving towards you to place the weft material in place, that heddle needs to travel up and down the length of the threads without meeting any resistance. Here I've got 2 textural threads, a wool boucle, as well as one that is considered a novelty yarn where several different threads are plied together, and there are instances where there are slubs created. Yes, that is a real technical term that we use to describe the composition of a yarn like this. This girth of this yarn throws up a red flag for me because I know that within the interior of this heddle, there are small spaces where it needs to travel back and forth. If you're concerned if a thread is going to be appropriate, you can always test it out in your reed. Quite literally, you can go over, and I like to test it in the holes versus the slots. There we are. Draw the thread through. And what I'm observing during this demonstration is if my reed or heddle is moving up and down the length of the warp threads, are there any catch points in that small hole that would prevent the reed or heddle from moving freely? In this case, I think it works quite nicely, and it would give me the green sort of flag to go on and use it during my design process. The one that we have here left on the table, however, immediately I know that I would have a difficult trouble even passing this through the reed. So I might reserve this as a weft only material. Some yarns have unique characteristics that we need to consider. Mohair, specifically brushed mohair, gets a bad rap sometimes with weavers that it has unique characteristics in its manufacturing process that make the weaving and the warping challenging. Knowing these challenges ahead of time, you can either avoid them or put a plan in place to make them work better for you. If a weaver came to me with the intention to take a skein of yarn similar to this one and fill every space and hole in their reed, I would strongly caution them against it. Although the interior of this thread does not look very thick, what's being expanded from the core are fibery fingers that are coming out. And when the threads are placed directly next to multiples and they're trying to move against each other, those fingers reach out and grab on like Velcro, making it difficult to transfer the threads onto the back beam, as well as during the weaving process to get nice clean sheds. If you would like to incorporate something like this into your weaving, please know first off, a thread like this has a lot of personality, and oftentimes in design, it's to your advantage to use it in smaller proportions anyway. So for your first attempt at using mohair in the warp way direction, brushed mohair in the warp way direction, try spacing it and giving yourself somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inches space between the next mohair. The fingers will not have an opportunity to grab onto each other, and they'll be supported by smoother composition threads on either side of it. Otherwise, it's also appropriate to use as a weft material if you really want that fuzzy, warm feeling in your finished fabric. Some threads are going to just simply have a lot of bulk to them. In our studio, you'll see a variety of different sizes coming through. But in this case, this is a very good example of a thread that is generous in girth, what we might consider a bulky weight yarn. So choosing a yarn like this, you're really going to want to make sure that you have the right equipment on hand to handle it. And one of the things is taking into consideration the size of the heddle that you're using. These type of threads really need a nice big generous space that will accommodate its girth, such as this 5-dent reed. In some cases, we're looking at the characteristics of the yarn. Do they have interesting dye applications, such as this thread, what we refer to as a gradient, where the threads have been dyed in such a way where you get many, many yards of material in one color before it transitions into another. Using this in the warp or weft way direction are going to give you very different results. In the warp way direction, you could probably imagine that you would wind several ends of your warp before it switches. In the warped final appearance, you might have nice pinstripes or broad stripes depending on the length of your warp and how much yardage you were able to get out of it. In the weft way direction, alternatively, you might have large blocks of color depending on the width of your piece before it transitions into another. Very fun to design with a yarn like this, but make sure that you're familiar and you're able to anticipate what might happen with these unique dye jobs. Alternatively, this is what we consider a painted or variegated skein of yarn. And you can see different in this one, colors are changing at a much more rapid pace and it can give you an overall speckled effect in the warp or weft way direction. Used in both applications, you can anticipate a self-plaiting, which can be very fun for a new weaver to experience. And lots of wonderful hand dyers out there that you might want to take advantage of their unique color palettes.